Greetings and welcome to A Contemplative Reader, where together we will explore the mysterious, the mystical, the spiritual, the otherworldly, and the transcendent in various books and literature. Today I'm recording this video in one of my favorite spots for contemplative reading, and that is my back porch. There's going to be some noise involved, but hopefully it won't be too disturbing. So today I'm going to be exploring the second book in the Book of the New Sun series by one of my favorite authors, Gene Wolfe. The book is called The Claw of the Conciliator. A few non-spoiler thoughts to begin with. I have read this book now 3 times, and I still don't understand all of it, I'm sure. I read it last summer, I read it again over the winter, I read it again earlier this summer. Some of it is due to Wolfe's language, some of it is due to his way of storytelling, some of it is due to the fact that I'm sure that he is planting seeds which will grow later in this series that I just don't know what's going on yet. So having said that, I didn't enjoy this book quite as much as I did Shadow the Torture, which is one of my favorite sci-fi fantasy books of all time so far. At times it's just too confusing, too weird, too bizarre, as I'll get into later. But his writing still totally captivates me. I always enjoy writing that engages that part of my brain which searches for deeper meaning, for symbolism, particularly in the religious and spiritual sense. So Wolfe, I think, really in the sci-fi and fantasy genres, at least, has few, if any, equals in that regard. I know some people have quit the series after reading these first 2 books, just finding it to be too weird, too confusing. They don't like Severian. I get all that. But for me, I enjoy his writing because I find it to be both challenging and captivating, and for the most part, enjoyable as well. Other videos that are out there on BookTube have explored The Claw of the Conciliator and its plot in great detail, so I'm not going to give a great big plot explanation at this point, but just here's a brief summary. We find Severian outside of the walls of the city of Nessus at the beginning of this book. Again, he grew up in the Guild of Torturers within the city of Nessus, but he was expelled. He ends up traveling through Nessus, meets various companions, has this kind of event at the wall at the end of Shadow the Torture, but we kind of fast forward a little bit, and he's now in a different city, the village of Saltus, at the beginning of Claw the Conciliator. His other companions he's been separated from, and he is now with a person named Jonas. More on Jonas later. So Severian is now a full-fledged executioner. Again, he was trained as a torturer, but he was given the sword Terminus Est when he was expelled from the Guild of Torturers, and he is now picking up freelance work as an executioner on his way to his ultimate destination in the city of Thrax. So in this book, we encounter various characters that we first met in Shadow the Torturer. He fights off weird creatures typical of 70s and 80s fantasy sci-fi books, such as 8-men creatures. He has more strange and disturbing relationships with the women in his life, and he ends up in the House Absolute, the home of the autarch himself. More details about the plot in the spoiler section. So like I did with Shadow the Torture, I want to really spend most of my time here exploring some of the spiritual themes and symbolism found within this book. Wolfe's knowledge of the Christian faith, its stories, its meaning, its symbolism, are really quite deep, particularly that relating to his own Catholic faith. As with Shadow the Torture, several of the characters, at least the human characters of the story, are named after saints from Christian tradition or figures from the Bible. I want to talk specifically about 3 general themes relating to spiritual or religious symbolism that I find in this story. First, there are various allusions to the biblical story of the Passion of Jesus, the events leading up to the death of Jesus on the cross, and then, of course, his resurrection. Sometimes in the church and its tradition, this is referred to as the Paschal Mystery. Second, there is a sacramental theme once again in this story. Shadow the Torturer had a sacramental theme revolving around baptism, and in this book, the sacrament that is involved is the sacrament of communion, the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper. Also allusions, I think, as well to the sacrament of anointing of the sick in the Catholic tradition. Third theme of spiritual and religious symbolism is time. This is the book where Wolfe really starts to play with the subject of time and how there are events in ongoing chronological time, and then periodically there are events which seem to occur outside of that. Events which occur in a sort of eternal time or time outside of time, relating to the Christian idea of kairos and chronos. Kairos being the Greek word for eternal time, God's time, unusual time, time outside of time, however you want to translate it, and chronos, the ongoing march of chronological time. So, spoiler section is coming up now. So again, the first spiritual theme that I want to talk about is symbolism relating to the story of the death and resurrection of Christ recorded in the Gospels, the Passion of Christ, or the Paschal Mystery, and how it connects to the story of the Claw of the Conciliator. So there are allusions to this story found in the part of Claw of the Conciliator fairly quickly into the narrative regarding Severian's execution of a woman named Morwenna. So Severian has now found himself in the village of Saltus, and he's a freelance executioner. He has been hired by the local townsfolk to execute this woman named Morwenna. She is accused of being a witch and poisoning members of her family. Is she guilty? I don't know if Wolfe really answers that question for us, but based upon, I think, her symbolic Christ-like figure placement in this story, I think perhaps she is innocent, or at least that's what I'm getting out of it anyway. So Morwenna is named after a saint. She's named after Saint Morwenna, who was a 6th century English saint who lived in a hermitage overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. And in fact, her primary accuser is a woman named Eusebia. And Eusebia is named after a 7th century French nun and saint named Saint Eusebia. So, Morwenna and Severian are on this stand or platform where she is to be executed. Morwenna declares her innocence before this crowd of onlookers who is gathered to see this scene. But she accepts her fate, and she even goes on to forgive those who are responsible for her execution, including Severian standing there in front of her. Much like Jesus, before he was crucified, said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Severian proceeds to execute Morwenna through beheading using his sword Terminus Est, but first there's an unusual detail. He breaks her legs. And I think that alludes to the story of the crucifixion as well. Jesus on the cross did not have his legs broken. That is to fulfill the prophecy found in the Old Testament that his legs should not be broken. But the thief on the cross next to him, the one who Jesus said one day would be with him in paradise, his legs were broken, according to the Roman practice. So I think there's a connection there. Another thing, I think naming Severian's primary companion at this point in the story Jonas is also a possible allusion to the passion narrative of Jesus. Jonas is another name for Jonah, the Old Testament figure who was in the belly of the great fish or whale for 3 days before being spat out on land. Jesus, later on in the New Testament, uses the story of Jonah as prefiguring his own coming crucifixion and resurrection. Just as Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days and then was metaphorically resurrected by being spat back out, Jesus would be in the tomb for 3 days before his resurrection. Jonah was a sailor on the seas. Jonas was a sailor of the stars before he had, he's recounting this story to Severian later in the story. He had this crash landing on Earth where he has this resurrection experience of sorts. Again, becomes this kind of sort of a hybrid robot human being, a robot with some human flesh on it. But of course, this story, Book of the New Sun and Claw of the Conciliator, primarily revolve around the story of Severian. And there are connections between Severian and the story of Jesus' Passion. The whole narrative, I think, is a story of encountering death and finding new life. But a specific allusion to the Passion narrative of Jesus is found when Severian, who is within the dangerous territory of the House Absolute, again the home of the autarch, starts to sweat blood. just as Jesus sweat blood when he was praying in the garden before he was crucified. Again, the whole meaning of this story, according to the Christian tradition, is to achieve reconciliation between God and humanity, which has fallen. And so when the role of the Conciliator is explained in this book, I think that there's a connection there. And that happens when Dorcas explains it. Again, the Conciliator is this mysterious figure worshipped by characters in the book of the New Sun. And Dorcas has had her own death and resurrection experience. Sorry for the train in the background. Dorcas is this figure in the New Testament who had this death and resurrection experience, and now Dorcas, who Severian encountered in Shadow of the Torture, develops this relationship with, had her own death and resurrection experience. So Dorcas perhaps has a unique vantage point to explain the role of the Conciliator. And she tells Severian that the story goes that the Conciliator once took a dying woman by the hand and a star by the other. From that time forward, he had the power to reconcile the universe with humanity and humanity with the universe, ending the old breach. He had a way of vanishing, then reappearing when everyone thought he was dead, reappearing sometimes after he had been buried. So again, healing the breach between humanity and the universe, just like Jesus healed the breach between humanity and God. And then these mysterious appearances, much like the post-death and resurrection appearances of Jesus recorded in the Gospels. There are perhaps other connections between Claude the Conciliator and the Passion narrative in the Gospels, but I'm going to move on to the second spiritual theme I want to talk about in Claude the Conciliator, and that is the sacramental symbolism. Again, in Shadow of the Torture, we had the baptismal symbolism, and here I think we have Eucharistic symbolism as well as some symbolism related to anointing of the sick. So just briefly, a sacrament in the Christian tradition, according to those Christian traditions which have more of a sacramental emphasis, such as Wolfe's Catholic faith, believe that a sacrament is a visible sign of an invisible grace. The finite becomes capable of bearing the infinite. The waters, ordinary water, can carry along with it the regenerating power of Christ's death and resurrection through this unity with Christ in the waters of baptism. And in the Eucharist, bread and wine become for sacramental Christians the body and blood of Christ. Again, the infinite grace of God in these ordinary things of water, bread, and wine. Early on in Claude the Conciliator, Wolfe foreshadows the sacramental symbolism when he alludes to the story of Jesus turning water into wine. A story early on in the Gospel of John, which foreshadowed the coming institution of the Eucharist. On only the second page of the book, Jonas and Severian discovered that water in their jug had indeed become wine. The big scene, which has a direct Eucharistic overtone, is a disturbing and bizarre one, where Wolfe takes Eucharistic imagery of the Last Supper and turns it on its head. And it involves a meal sponsored by Vodulus. Vodulus, again, is this mysterious character who Severian encountered early on in Shadow of the Torture, and Severian develops this infatuation with him of sorts. And so in Claude the Conciliator now we find Vodulus has essentially captured Jonas and Severian, and they're being forced to participate in this meal where they are to eat the body of a deceased person, in this case Thecla. Thecla being Severian's lover in Shadow of the Torture, and when Thecla's torture was to be too much, Severian provided the means to her for her to end her life, resulting in his expulsion from the Guild of Torturers. So the body, however Thecla ended up in their hands is not explained, I don't think, but the body is to be eaten along with Alzabo, which is the mysterious alien creature, and through the ingestion of the Alzabo in the flesh, this deceased person becomes alive again in a very real sense, or at least united with the person eating this meal. Their memories come alive again in the person of eating the meal. So, very bizarre, very disturbing, and difficult to read it, to be honest. But once you get through it, you can see how Wolfe is taking the story of the Last Supper and turning it on its head here to make this scene a meaningful one, although very disturbing. So just as sacramental Christians believe that through communion they are participating in the real presence of Christ, Vodalus, Severian, and others who are eating the body of Thecla along with Alzaba believe that they are really participating in the essence of Thecla here. It's not just a matter of eating and drinking. There is a real transformation then that occurs. So in sacramental Christianity, the Christian is transformed through the sacraments into the likeness of Christ, again through the Eucharist, through baptism. Severian, in a very real way, was transformed into having a part of Thecla's essence in him. He was no longer just Severian from this point on, but a new person with Severian, the body of Severian and all of his life experience, but also Thecla's implanted in him, living on in him in a very real and tangible way. So, I'll just briefly talk about the claw of the Conciliator, and I think its connection to the sacrament of anointing of the sick. Again, the claw of the Conciliator itself is the mysterious relic of the Conciliator. The relic itself, according to the way the story is I'm interpreting it as unfolding, the relic itself does not necessarily give the healing or the anointing power itself, but it is Severian. Again, this person who is kind of progressing in life and experiencing death and resurrection in his own way, Severian working through the claw, which is causing this healing, in this case physical healing. Sacrament of the anointing of the sick, of course, is not physical healing normally anyway, but more of a spiritual healing. So the analogy can be made again to this sacrament. Anointing of the sick is used in a way, not that the oil is used, and the oil itself does not cause this spiritual healing in the sacrament. It is the sign of the healing word that comes from Christ through this oil and the words that are used as part of that ritual. It is the word and the oil through which this sacrament accomplishes healing, just as is the claw and the will of Severian and the one receiving the healing receive this power. The third spiritual theme that I want to talk about relates to time. I have the feeling we're just scratching the surface of this in Claw of the Conciliator, so here are just a few words about it. My thoughts are guided by two concepts from Christian theology. The first is that of Kairos time and Chronos time. Kairos time, again, being God's time, eternal time, time outside of time, and Chronos time being the ongoing march of time. The second is the concept of prolepsis, or proleptic theology, meaning that events in time are not defined by their linear progression. Time, which is ongoing on the calendar sort of sense, but are instead defined by their endpoint, their telos. The end is really the beginning. So you can think of it in the way of time. Normally the way we think of time is that there's a beginning point and it unfolds. A story unfolds, time unfolds to a later point, where really prolepsis or proleptic theology starts at the ending and kind of unfolds back. To understand the story, you have to know the ending of it. So, the whole story so far has been told from the future. If you think about it, the autarch Severian is recounting, again, famously and sometimes unreliable ways, recounting the stories of his life in a way that indicates that the nature of time plays in the role of the unveiling events itself. So here I want to go through some quotes which I think explore this. Early on, I think on the very first page of the book, we have this quote. Again, Severian here is sort of, he's dreaming, he's sleeping, and he's seeing the coming execution of Morwenna. And he sees these events as though I were the increate. Again, another name for the divine here. Peeping through his rent in eternity to behold the world of time. So again, we have Kairos and Chronos here. We have the ongoing march of time through which this story will unfold, Severian and the coming execution of Morwenna. But Severian also sees himself as this increate, the divine, peering through the rent in eternity, seeing this story unfold from the vantage point of eternity. Later on, there's a discussion between Severian, the chatelaine Thea, and Vodalus about time in the world. That's found in this edition here on page 331. The chatelaine Thea is talking with Vodalus and Severian. And she says, "Do you know how our world was renamed, Torturer? The Dawn Men went to Red Verthandi, who was then named War, and because they thought they had an ungracious sound that would keep others from just following them, they renamed it, calling it Present, with a capital P. That was a jest in their tongue, for the same word meant now and the gift. Or so one of our tutors once explained the matter to my sister and me, though I do not see how any language could endure such confusion." And then Vodalus is listening, it says, and then Thea continues on. "Then others, who would have drawn a people to the innermost habitable world for their own reasons, took up the game as well and called that world Skuld, the world of the future. Thus our own became Earth, the world of the past." And then Vodalus says, "You are wrong in that, I fear. I have it on good authority that this world of ours has been called by that name from the utmost reaches of antiquity." So I think that little conversation there between Vodalus and the chatelaine Thea gives us this fascinating insight into the way Wolfe is implanting themes of time and, eternal time and chronological time, and what vantage point you're looking at time. If you're looking at it from the end or the beginning, all of that is unpacking here in this story. Another little interesting comment on time occurs when Severian is in the House Absolute, and he notices, "In my innocence, I suppose that the borders of the House Absolute, which extended both in space and in time, so much further than the uninformed would guess, could be strictly delimited, and that I was approaching or was soon approach or had already passed them." So again, Severian, from the future vantage point of telling the story, is giving us the hint that the House Absolute is not limited by space and time, but it goes beyond space and time, much like what we in Christian tradition would say is eternity, or the realm of the divine. Towards the end of the book, there's some very interesting things regarding time, which I want to talk about here for just a minute. We have here a comment by one of the witches that Severian encounters at the end of the story. And this witch notes, "All time exists. That is the truth beyond the legends the epochs tell. If the future did not exist now, how could we journey toward it? If the past does not exist still, how could we leave it behind us? In sleep the mind is encircled by its time, which is why we so often hear the voices of the dead there and receive intelligence of things to come. Those who, like the mother, have learned to enter the same state while walking live surrounded by their own lives, even as the Abraxas perceives all of time as an eternal instant." Again, very much the theme of eternal time and chronological time there, as well as what vantage point you're looking at time, indicated by the story of this witch was telling. And then just a couple of pages later, you have this conversation between Dorcas and Severian again. Dorcas, one of my favorite characters in this story, I think, because of these insights she gives us. So Dorcas wonders, what has happened to us? And Severian, I think it's Severian who is responding here, "I think we are seeing ourselves from a perspective longer than a single instance." So again, a theme of Kairos time and Chronos time, and the vantage point with which we look at time, which I think relates to the play, which takes up an entire chapter of this story. Again, the characters that Severian encountered in Shadow of the Torturer Dr. Talos, Baldanders, Jolenta, Dorcas, all this traveling troupe of people putting on these plays from Dr. Talos, and Severian was part of that in Shadow of the Torture. Now he's reunited with them in the Halves Absolute, and they put on this play called Eschatology and Genesis. I find that play to be extremely confusing. There is symbolism in there with regard to these creatures, the sons of God and man named the Nephilim, which relates back to a story early on in Genesis. There are videos from other folks out there on BookTube. I'll highlight my friend Sam of the iSamwise channel. I'll try and remember to link his video on this below. He touches on this and gives an explanation of some of eschatology in Genesis, the Nephilim, and so forth. So I'm not going to go into that, other than to just notice that the very title of the play itself plays into that theme I've been talking about, and what vantage point you're looking at time. Again, looking at time sort of outside of time, or from the end of time, looking back into the ongoing march of chronological time. Because eschatology is the Christian mode of Christian theology which deals with the end times, the teleology, the things that occur when we believe that Christ will return one day and renew all things. And eschatology is the study of that. And that normally you'd think would come last. But again, Wolfe inverts the title. It's eschatology, end things first, and then Genesis. Genesis, of course, being the first book of the Bible, the story of the creation and the like. So again, that word that I mentioned before, prolepsis or proleptic theology, looking at time and the events of time from the vantage point of the end, the eschaton, the telos, then looking back as far back as the Genesis, as far back as the beginning. So I think we're just scratching the surface on the subject of time in Claw of the Conciliator, and looking forward to seeing what Wolfe does with that subject in future books, as well as his other spiritual and religious symbolism. Let me know your thoughts. I know this is a book series that has been explored and debated a lot out there, so I'm looking forward to see what you think. I have some more reading to catch up on in other series, and then I'm going to move on to Book 3, Sword of the Lictor, and hopefully do an analysis like that one. Thank you for watching. Peace be with you.